Film Story Treatment Lethargy Part 1. 1. A suburb of New York City, the Suffolk area, Dix Hill, end of April. A minivan taxi pulls up outside a private cottage in Dix Hills. The driver honks his horn. 5 people exit the house. 44. Gregory Schonecker, his grandfather, 95. Klaus Schonecker, his wife Jane, 38, daughter Christina, 15, and son Carl, 12. A taxi driver puts a pile of suitcases in the trunk. The old man sends the family out the gate, saying, "Tomorrow you will see the Austria that I left 50 years ago to come to America. I hope you won't get lost there, because it's not for nothing that I taught you to speak German." The family says goodbye to the old man and gets into a taxi. Take the 495 motorway to Kennedy International Airport by taxi. Before takeoff, Gregor receives a call on his mobile from his assistant Peter Furman. He informs him that the medical equipment has been left in a safe place at the psychiatric clinic in Salzburg run by Peter Lem, a friend of his boss from his student days. After thanking Furman for his work, Gregor calls Lem. He confirms that Gregor's paper is on the program of an international symposium of psychotherapists. Number 2. The Schonecker family on board a Boeing 747 bound for Europe. Gregor switches on the notebook and shows the family pictures of the town with the Alps in the background. Klaus had recommended that they visit these places. Here's the hotel at the foot of the Venediger, where the Schoneckers will stay. The first week, Gregor will be attending a symposium in Salzburg, so the family will have to be alone. But after that, the 4 of them will enjoy the exotic Alps. It's night. Most of the passengers are asleep. Gregor snoozes as he looks out the porthole at the starry sky. Suddenly, he sees one of the Boeing's engines catch fire, then another, then a wing snap, and the plane plummets downwards, tilting violently on its side. Shocked, Gregor cries out, "We're going down." Awakened by the screaming, fellow travelers look around in surprise. Seeing no danger, they all look at the man who startled them. Meanwhile, Gregor is slumped in his chair, unconscious. A worried stewardess arrives. Is he having a heart attack? She puts a cold compress on Gregor's forehead and asks over the loudspeaker if there are any medics among the passengers. A man calls out. Although Gregoris is heavily medicated, he continues to deteriorate, with a weak pulse and falling blood pressure. A medic urgently performs a massage of the heart area. But this doesn't help Gregor. Jane remembers that her husband had a similar crisis a couple of times and that he recovered without anyone's help. There is widespread concern on board about the condition of a fellow passenger. After a while, Gregor suddenly takes a deep breath and closes his eyes, to everyone's surprise. Not understanding why the crowd of people around him are staring at him, Gregor feels uncomfortable. Jane reassures him, "It's all right, dear. You were just dreaming." There is applause. The passengers speculate what kind of illness, epilepsy, heart failure, or what. The doctor who performed the heart massage muses, "It seems to be a pathology, or maybe it's a sign of lethargy." 3. International conference in Salzburg, bringing together experts from all over the world. Gregor Schonecker is presented as a promising psychotherapist from the USA. While giving a presentation on a new method of treatment in psychiatry with electromagnetic waves, Gregor demonstrates on the screen the results of his tests: rapid recovery from alcohol and drug addiction, positive changes in the treatment of other mental illnesses, etc. Later, Assistant Furman introduces 2 Germans, Don and Kurt, to Gregor. They are impressed by the scientific invention and praise it. However, Gregor is only annoyed by the dithyrambs and goes to a hotel to rest. When the evening comes, Gregorio's assistant meets the 2 Germans at an entertainment club. Half-naked go-go girls dance on the podium to the music. Furman persuades the Germans that he has carried out a series of experiments on medical equipment without the boss's knowledge, not only on psychotic people but also on normal people. Schonecker, on the other hand, is foolishly stubborn, afraid of experimentation and unaware of his assistant's sensational discoveries. Dan and Kurt are reluctant to believe Furman's ramblings and are driven out of patience by the persistence of their plebeian interlocutor. But he says he can demonstrate some miracles tomorrow. All he needs is a couple of volunteer testers for the experiment. The Germans ask, "Are these experiments risky?" Gregorio's assistant answers cheekily, "The fate of the lab rats is unpredictable." because it pays to sacrifice lives in the name of science. 4. Gregor undergoes a series of demonstration sessions at Peter Lem's psychiatric clinic. Symposium participants are fascinated by the unique treatment method. After the demonstration, Gregor's assistant says he has to stay as the equipment has to be prepared for tomorrow. Late evening. A car pulls up outside the clinic. 4 people get out, the 2 Germans and 2 athletic young men. Furman leads them through the security. In the laboratory, he lectures the Germans. The wave effect is fantastic, far more energizing than drugs or doping. It makes a person much more enduring. His physical strength increases several times over, and he can stay active and productive for a couple of weeks without sleep. What is particularly important is that under the influence of the waves, the patient obeys orders absolutely. The test subjects are fitted with special helmets and Furman switches on the equipment. The patients fall asleep without seeing the waves. After a while, Furman disconnects the medical apparatus. The test subjects are taken to a room with walls made of soft material. Over a loudspeaker, Furman gives the command, "Kelt," and the 2 men jump to their feet. "Run in circles," and they both rush to the wall. "Break the wall!" And the 2 men start pounding their fists with insane force until their knuckles are covered in blood. The Germans' eyes pop out of their foreheads. Furman says, "This is just the beginning. Let's get the 2 rats to the training ground." Mocking the test subjects, Dan shouts over the loudspeaker, "Do push-ups," and they comply. "Stand on your heads," and both men obediently stand with their feet up. Kurt marvels, "It's phenomenal. They don't feel any fatigue." Furman rejoices, "Didn't I tell the truth? This equipment costs billions." 5. After the symposium, Gregor returns to his family in the mountain town. The hotel receptionist offers several hiking routes along the mountain trails for active recreation. So on Sunday morning, Schonecker, his wife, and 2 children set off on a several-kilometer-long hike along the Venediger Ridge. As they head back, a 60-year-old woman with a giant rucksack on her back unexpectedly emerges from behind a rock. The Schoneckers' surprised eyes follow the strange woman as she nimbly skips down the mountain path, the pebbles crumbling. Humming to herself, the vivacious woman slides down a smooth rock on her bottom and disappears from view, waving a wooden stick in a cheerful manner. Gregorio's family looks at each other in surprise. The hotel receptionist is not surprised. Guests from America have seen the town's icon, the oddball Catherine, returning home after her Sunday hike. A recluse living alone, her parents died years ago. She comes down to the foot of the mountains only to collect her social allowance, which she somehow squanders on buying sheets, laundry detergents, nappies, and medicine. She does not communicate with anyone, and even when asked, she does not explain what these purchases are for. Only occasionally does she mention the angel sleeping somewhere. And the strangest thing is Catherine's Sunday hike up the mountain. Maybe it's a sectarian ritual, maybe an unconventional rite, or maybe a manifestation of the unfortunate woman's madness. Catherine's father is said to have been a fanatical scientist, a professor of mineralogy. He is said to have studied the geological structure of mountains, so perhaps the stammering daughter thinks she is following in her father's footsteps. The receptionist points out a place where you can see Catherine's homestead 10 kilometers away with binoculars. Gregor is inexpressibly intrigued by the mystery of the Alpine hermit. 6. Gregor is set off on Saturday evening towards Catherine's homestead with his climbing ammunition. He sleeps the night in his sleeping bag, lying down on the grass in the meadow. He sets his alarm for 4 a.m. Waking up, he sniffs the binoculars and sees Catherine milking the goat, shaking off the dried laundry in the yard, and then, with her backpack on her back, trotting out of the gate at a brisk trot. Gregor runs after the woman. She needs to keep a good distance to avoid being spotted by the stalker. The route chosen by the woman is quite steep. Gregor has to sweat a lot to keep up. Catherine follows the narrow, treacherous paths, negotiating the difficult terrain with great skill. Catherine seems to know the Venediger well. The ridge spires are more than 3 kilometers high, and even in summer are covered with snow and ice. She is extremely resilient, and there comes a moment when Gregor realizes he is falling behind. Suddenly, there is a rumbling sound like a mountain avalanche, and boulders the size of footballs start falling nearby. Fortunately, Gregor manages to escape at the last moment, bouncing to the side and hiding in an alcove in the rock. After waiting for everything to calm down, he continues climbing upwards. In the distance, he sees Catherine carrying a pile of rock pieces and placing them at the edge of the cliff. Gregor realizes that the madwoman is playing a trick of sorts. With each climb, she artificially causes the rocks to collapse in an attempt to scare off unwanted trackers and thus block their way. After setting an ambush for possible pursuers, Catherine pulls up again. When she reaches a perpendicular rock, she stops. Gregor watches the woman through binoculars. She finally puts on her bulging rucksack and wipes her sweat. Then she looks around carefully and, with her hand on the stone ledge, pulls out what appears to be a metal bar. She slides the rod into a narrow crevice in the rock and starts to lift it up and down. The massive block of rock bends and slowly slides away. Is there a hollow cavity? Catherine pushes her massive rucksack casually through the narrow crack into the cavern and then slides in herself. Surprisingly, the opening closes immediately. Gregor gets his bearings. He proceeds with great caution, the intrigue increasing with each step. He finds a metal bar used for leverage and places it in the plinth. With a slight lift, the rock chunk slides away to reveal a dark opening. Gregor crawls into a zigzag tunnel. It gets darker as he descends. Soon, an underground cavity of about 300 square meters, quite high, comes into view. Compared to the summer mountain climate, the underground is quite cool, maybe only 10 degrees Celsius, and even steam comes out of your mouth when you breathe the air. The sound of a spring echoes under the vaults. Gregor hides behind a rock ledge. Where has he got to? He turns on the video camera he has brought with him. 7. Catherine lights a kerosene lamp to illuminate the cavity. In the middle of the cavity, a coffin-shaped shroud made of wood and glass is placed on a platform. Catherine, muttering some words, removes the hood. Gregor does not believe his eyes. A woman's corpse seems to be lying there, covered with a white cloth. Catherine removes the cloth and then the gauze. Unbelievably, there are no signs of physical decomposition. The corpse seems to be absolutely unmarked by death. Is it embalmed? But why is Catherine treating the dead woman so incomprehensibly? Catherine draws spring water, pours it into a cast-iron tub and heats it on a portable gas stove. She then places the dead body on a wooden plank. Catherine uses the warmed water to wash every inch of the deceased's body. She then shampoos the corpse's long black hair and comb it thoroughly after drying it. Gregor films everything without interruption. He is stunned. Is it all a dream? The hygienic procedures continue. After washing and dry scrubbing the dead body, Catherine rubs it with essential oils and a pungent aroma spreads around. This is immediately followed by another treatment, an intense massage of the dead body. Afterwards, Catherine dresses the deceased in a clean gown, wraps her in white sheets, and drapes her in a woolen blanket after lifting her onto a post. But that's not all. Catherine sits the deceased down, covers her with pillows, and, with her mouth open, inserts a funnel with a tube. She takes a container out of her rucksack, which seems to contain goat's milk. She heats the milk on the stove, pours it into the funnel with a spoon, and then gives the dead woman a drink. Later, Catherine brushes the dead man's teeth with a toothbrush and wipes his mouth with cotton wool soaked in some liquid. Gregor is breathless. Has the recluse gone completely mad? What kind of person would treat a corpse like that? Something is wrong here. What if this is not a dead woman? What if this woman is alive, but in a lethargic sleep? I'm glad because the CCTV camera has captured unique images. After the feeding session, Catherine tidies up the room a bit, takes the scriptures, and reads the Psalms in a half voice. As the Christian ritual continues, Gregor realizes it is time for him to leave, especially since an idea has been born in his mind. He desperately needs to visit Catherine's house before she returns. Could there be an intriguing secret lurking in that farmhouse? Number 8. Gregor's energy level increases dramatically after his miracle-like adventure. He crawls out of the cave, and with the help of a mechanical jack, he closes the opening with a quick step and rushes downwards. An hour later, Gregor finds himself at the foot of a farmhouse gate. Everything around here has a strange air of domesticity. A goat munches on the grass nearby. A little further on, a flock of sheep is grazing, bleating, tumbling down, tied in a strange knot by ropes. Catherine seems to be afraid that the loose sheep might wander away. Sacks of freshly shorn sheep's wool are piled in the yard. A dog barks incessantly in the yard. Gregor pulls out a sandwich, takes a bite, and chomps loudly. Gregor gives the dog a piece of sausage, and it stops barking immediately. When Gregor opens the gate, he drops another piece, and the hungry dog wags its tail. There are no locks on the hut door. Once inside, the view is surprising. The rooms are sterile and clean, and the household is in perfect order, even though the furniture and utensils are old. Is this excessive tidiness another manifestation of the woman's cowardice? One room has been turned into a mineral museum. Another appears to be Catherine's parents' bedroom. Gregorio's attention is drawn to the photographs on the walls and to the bookcase in the corner filled to the top with books. Here are the pages of thick notebooks, dated 1940, 1941, 1942, etc. Are these diaries? German letters, excellent handwriting. As I read the 1942 diary, the words catch my eye. That fateful day, 23rd of January, turned our lives upside down when we experienced God's infinite grace. Such a fantasy is too daring even for Andersen's fairy tales. The snowy Austrian Alps gave us a baby. Gregor cannot resist the blasphemous temptation to stuff the bundle containing Catherine's mother's diaries into his rucksack and hurriedly disappear from the farmhouse. Number 9. Meanwhile, Furman is experimenting with the effects of electromagnetic waves on test subjects. The Germans' interest grows with each passing day. Doping this strong has so far only been dreamt of. It is a technological breakthrough that is unparalleled and can be used not only for medical or sporting purposes, but also for military purposes. The manufacturers of the equipment would dictate the terms to both NATO and their enemies' military structures. Physical endurance tests continue throughout the week, even at night. Furman and the two Germans work alternately. Finally, as the health resources of the test subjects run out, it is decided to get rid of them, so a final experiment in obedience is carried out. One man is ordered to jump off the roof of a building. Without the slightest hesitation, he jumps from a height of 30 meters and, of course, gets killed. The second test subject maintains the exercise for a couple of days, but then his heart stops beating. The test results are incredible. The doping effect is grandiose. Interested parties, Dan and Kurt, is working on a plan to take over the medical equipment, but Furman admits that he has no legal rights to Chef Schonecker's invention. In addition, the main classified control console of the equipment is kept in a safe by Schonecker, and even if it is stolen, there is no guarantee that the rest of the machine's know-how can be revealed. The following week, the Germans, accompanied by Furman, go to the hotel where the Schoneckers are staying. They try to persuade Gregor to become a partner, to cooperate in setting up a unique medical laboratory, and for a start, Gregor could entrust the partners with new equipment. Of course, the Germans are not told about Furman's secret experiments. In an attempt to get Gregor on their side, they offer a hefty sum in return for a vote of confidence. However, Gregor categorically refuses to leave the equipment, especially since his plans do not include setting up a laboratory in Europe. He adds that the effects of the equipment have not been fully investigated, and the device itself has not been patented as a scientific invention. Interested parties leave in a huff, having achieved nothing. Furman is forced to obey Schonecker's order, and the next day prepares the medical equipment for shipment to the United States. For the Germans, the only way left is to get the stubborn one on their side. Furman must help bring the equipment from the mad scientist into the custody of an influential international organization. Furman is threatened that he must obey or face criminal charges as a perpetrator of illegal experiments that have resulted in the death of 2 people. Intimidated by brazen blackmail, Furman vows to do whatever he is told. 10. From Monday morning, Gregoris devotes himself to reading blogs. He completely disconnects himself from his surroundings, even forgetting that he is on holiday with his family in the Alps. Page after page, he immerses himself in the bitter period of World War II, in the details of the lives of strangers from Austria. He rereads the pages of the diary several times in depth, describing the fateful accident that truly revolutionized the lives of Catherine's parents. A story full of drastic events captures Gregorio's imagination. Gerda and Richard Killert, then childless, moved from Vienna to the Alps just before the war, in the summer of 1939. They settled in a farmhouse near Venediger at an altitude of almost 2 kilometers. The Celts thought they were protecting themselves from the Nazis, which was also the will of Richard's father, a mineralogical researcher. Kellert the Elder initiated his son Richard, who was pursuing a career as a scientist, into a mystery. In the archives of the museums, he found a map which he used to trace a cavity on the Venediger Ridge, 2.5 kilometers up, which was full of finds that would be of interest to archaeologists and historians. He believed it to be the hiding place of deserters from the ancient Hannibal army. Eventually, Richard became immersed in the scientific treasure discovered in the cave. To save time, he often stayed overnight in the rather cold and damp cavity. Early one morning in January 1942, an incredible thing happened. It was a Saturday. Richard and his wife, with a bull in their sleigh, set off into the mountains, their dog following them. The winter morning was not cold, just a few degrees below zero. As they ascended, it began to snow heavily, and, although it was already dawn, visibility through the thick veil of snowflakes was only a couple of meters. But at that moment, 2 single shots rang out in the mountains. This was immediately followed by a series of automatic weapons. A heavy silence followed. The dog ran away, panting. The Cellartines realized that there had been a firefight somewhere high up and wondered whether it would not be better to postpone the climb today. Suddenly, someone on skis was skating not far from them. Then there was a loud thump and someone rolled. It looked like the person on the skis was about to get hit. A minute later, there was an incredible sound, a baby screaming. How did a little child get here? He seemed to be screaming right next to it. Without waiting for anything, the couple rushed towards the screaming child. To their surprise, they saw a baby falling into the snow skier. She was a young woman of about 25 years old. She appears to have suffered a severe head injury, causing her to lose consciousness. The silence was broken again by the baby's shrill scream. The surprised Cellartines had a sudden realization. The baby is in her skirts, between the skier's legs. Had the woman just given birth to a baby? There was a need to hurry. Every minute counts in such cases. Although the conditions were inadequate, Richard's wife deftly carried out the necessary procedures. She had worked as a midwife in Vienna. Soon the couple were holding a baby girl, born underweight and about 7 months premature. Gerda quickly tucked the baby into a warm blanket to prevent her from freezing to death. The dog ran off and whined pitifully. Perhaps something is wrong in the mountains? Richard tried to go searching, but the bad weather made it a futile task. Attached to its mother's breast, the baby greedily suckles the teat. The mother had milk, but she never regained consciousness. She appeared to have been in a coma. Desperate to save her life, the couple decided not to delay and soon turned the sledge back towards home. When the mother was safely brought back to the farmhouse, she seemed to be on her way out. Her pulse was getting slower and slower, her body temperature was dropping, and her breathing was getting worse and worse. Gerda lamented her inability to help the dramatically dying young mother. Although there was barely any life left in her body, she was in a deep coma, and there was little hope that the stranger would survive. Yet, strangely enough, her mammary glands were still functioning. Much to the Kellerts' delight, the newborn was lively and voracious. The Kellerts had a goat with enough milk to keep the baby going if she ran out of breast milk. At dawn on Sunday, Richard set about hammering the coffin. But there is still hope. Maybe the doctors will help? But on Monday, as Richard descended the mountain into the town, he heard people talking about the surprise raids by SS officers on this corner of the town in search of escaped Jewish criminals, a man and his pregnant wife. When the burgomaster saw Kellert, he asked if the SS had sometimes visited their farmhouse yesterday. They were determined to climb up in spite of the snowstorm. Richard realized that the fascists were looking for the woman they had taken in, so it was dangerous to call the local doctor. When his last hope of saving the dying woman was dashed, Richard returned home, despondent. On Tuesday morning, the mother's life seemed to have ended. The Sellertines decided to bury the woman. Richard dug a grave in his backyard, at the back of the barn. Gerda kissed the deceased's forehead before covering the coffin lid. She thought it was strange. Even though it was cold in the prairie, the deceased was not cold. Not even the joints of her fingers were numb with the stiffness of death. Something is wrong here. What if the mother isn't really dead? After all, there have been cases of a living person being laid in a grave hole, Gerda thought. It turned out that the mother's heart was still beating barely perceptibly, just a few times a minute, while her lungs were still breathing in and out slowly, almost imperceptibly. The couple decided that perhaps they were dealing with a natural phenomenon, a manifestation of an extremely rare condition called lethargy. And so, the mother of the newborn baby was saved from being buried in a grave pit. Rather spontaneously, she was christened Angel by Gerda. This name stuck to the unfortunate one. Richard couldn't get the woman's spouse out of his head. He decided to find a Jewish patriot who had fled from the SS, the husband of the lethargic patient. Wasn't this the man who had made the dog bark so pitifully? The dog took off on horseback to the same place. Richard hurried after it. The dog sniffed something and started furiously shoveling snow. Richard spotted a ski sticking out. When he uncovered it, he saw a horrible sight. A man lying there, dead and stiff, a pool of blood in the snow. Richard tried not to cringe. That day, even with help, it wouldn't have saved his life. The Sellertines buried him with honor in the pit reserved for his wife. 11. Having found no proof of the identity of the mother, the Kelets decided not to tell anyone, neither about the newborn nor about the fate of the girl's mother and father. Childless and without the blessing of parenthood, they christened the newborn Catherine and officially registered her surname. Researcher people understood his joy. His wife, a woman in her 40s, finally lucky enough to have a firstborn. So the baby of the woman who was dying of lethargy became Catherine, the daughter of the Kellerts. The Sellertines did not abandon the unfortunate lethargic woman, and special attention was paid to her care. However, the couple were concerned about the unpredictable visit of the SS on any given day, which could have a catastrophic ending for both the patient and the Kelets who were caring for her. There was another quandary. How can life be sustained and complications avoided in a body in deep lethargy? The thought occurred to me. Wouldn't it be safer to place the lethargic woman in a cave in the mountains, where the impact of the environment on her body is less? After all, apart from the Sellertines themselves, this magical place is unknown to anyone, away from warfare and from civilization in general. The natural conditions in Ertma were unique. The climate is almost independent of the seasons, and the temperature and relative humidity are almost constant. The task is quite difficult: how to keep the patient, without harming her health, enclosed in a rather chilly cavity that is only about 12 degrees. After all, the woman will be alone, unattended, and will only be visited once a week. The bed must be airtight to prevent harmful microorganisms, parasites, or other unwanted creatures from breeding inside. And how do you make sure that clean, carbon dioxide-free air gets into a high-tight enclosure? Richard concluded a special sarcophagus was needed. Richard put a lot of ingenuity and effort into it, and within a month the sarcophagus was made of wood and glass. After transporting the structure in pieces up the mountain, Richard assembled the sarcophagus on a special platform. To prevent people or animals from wandering in, the entrance to the cave was covered with a heavy block, which was ingeniously fitted with a mechanical jack. It seems that the Kellers only had to bring the lethargic woman back to this safe area. It was spring, the end of March. On Saturday, the whole Kellert trio arrived in the town. After spending the night with people they knew and leaving their baby Catherine in their care, the couple prepared to take Angel to the mountains on Sunday morning. But just at dawn, the SS suddenly invaded the town. As if they were on fire, they combed house after house, again looking for the same Jewish family that had hidden from the authorities back in January. It was announced that a high-ranking Salzburg SS officer had been involved in the audacious escape, having protected the criminal Jews. The Sellertines were worried. Today, irreparable trouble could happen. The executioners could catch the lethargic woman ready to be taken away. Unnoticed by anyone, they set off in a horse-drawn carriage back to the farmhouse. But an hour later, after a complaint from the timid neighbors, the SS soon broke into the home of the acquaintances who had given the Kellertys a stay. They called them and found out that the Kellerts had left only an hour earlier. The SS unit decided to catch up with them desperately. Meanwhile, the Sellertines went home. After loading the angel into the wagon, they set off up the mountain. The horse pulled the cart up as far as it could go, and further travel was only possible on foot. Gathering their strength, the Sellertines carried Angel in their arms. Leaving the little girl alone in the dark cave, the couple, although not fearing for her safety, wiped away a tear of remorse. The SS arrived at the Kellertys' homestead and found nothing there. Fortunately, they did not find any trace of the missing scientist's family. After searching the homestead, the SS found out that in addition to the 3 members of the family, there was another woman living in the Kellertys' house. The angry SS squad leader ordered the burning of the farmhouse. Returning, the Sellertines saw smoke rising in the distance. They were terrified. Was their house on fire? The couple were distressed because the property was probably doomed. As the wheels rolled downhill, a drastic avalanche suddenly occurred. The wagon and the horse were thrown off a steep cliff straight into the abyss. Yet the Kellerts miraculously escaped. The couple walked back to the farm and found the farm buildings burnt to the ground, and the barn was rotting away with the enclosed livestock. Only the crawl space and the items stored there survived the fire. So, in saving Angel, the Kellert family lost all their property. After losing their home, the Kellertys took shelter with the same people they knew in the town. They lived in hiding from the SS until the end of the war. The Kellerts did not forget the little Angel for a week. She was cared for with infinite love and devotion. After the war, the Kellerts rebuilt their homestead after receiving state compensation. Unfortunately, as Catherine grew older, she turned out to be mentally handicapped. Her parents were distressed and worried by her daughter's strange and, at other times, incomprehensible behavior. Fearing the children's ridicule because of her poor mental development and strange behavior, the Kellerts did not allow their daughter to go to school, even though she had learned to read and write from Gerda. Catherine's mental retardation was compensated for by her diligent contribution to the care of the Angel. Gerda taught her daughter the necessary hygiene and feeding procedures for a lethargic patient. However, the Kellertys were hesitant to reveal the truth about who her real mother was, so the riddle of the Angel remained unsolved in Catherine's mind. All these years, she has not deteriorated physically, and the aging process has not affected her at all. Her youthful face has remained unchanged for decades, and her body shape has remained unchanged. Death seems to have forgotten Angel altogether. The Celtics regarded such a phenomenon as a mystical phenomenon of nature, as an intervention of supernatural forces. The Sellertines, who considered the unwed woman to be a full member of the family, did not tell anyone about the anomalous illness. The mysterious mountain walks of the Kellert family were considered by the townspeople to be the whim of a stuttering scientist. The couple did not consider themselves deprived of life, but rather grateful to fate for the joy of parenthood, for the baby that fate had given them, and for the opportunity to experience phenomenal lethargy. The Celts boasted that their family was destined by the Lord to live the rest of their lives in an honest, happy, and meaningful way. Number 12. The diary, which describes mystical events, simply mesmerized Gregorus. He resolves to go to the high mountains once more, to visit the home of the victim of lethargy. He seems to have memorized the mountain route. After climbing up, Gregor unhooks a block of stone and, using a spotlight to light the path, crawls into the cave. When he reaches the cavity, he removes the glass cover. The Angel's life is pulsating somewhat. Incredible, the woman looks no more than 30 years old, her facial features preserved in perfection. It is strange that the woman's real age is 90 years or more. Gregor takes a close-up of her. This case of lethargy at the age of 60 is unprecedented in medical history. The thought arises, maybe the patient should be brought back to the States and treated. Maybe there is hope of reviving the lethargic patient with the help of whale equipment. On his way back, Gregor decides to visit Catherine. The borrowed diaries must be returned. The dog barked a little as he approached the gate, but calmed down when he recognized his visitor. Catherine is busy gutting a sheep carcass and does not lift her head. Gregor is sickened by the sight of dried intestines on the ropes, next to a dozen washed sheets. Catherine doesn't say a word to Gregor's call. Unsure of what to do, Gregor slowly walks around the house. Catherine does not seem to be paying attention to the strange man. At the back of the property, Grigoris notices 3 graves with flowers and crosses in place of tombstones. Immediately, Catherine emerges, her hands bleeding up to her elbows. Her eye sockets are as deep as wells, and her gaze is focused on the bundle Gregor has brought with him. The guest tries to smile in a friendly way, but Catherine angrily snatches the bundle out of his hands, saying, "You're a thief. You have no conscience. Shame on you." Gregor humbly apologizes. Finally, Catherine's anger melts away and she holds out her bony hand. "I am Catherine." Then she says in a whisper, "Don't wake up. Here are the graves." Gregor looks at the blood left on the fingers. Catherine says, "Did you miss the sheep?" Catherine is sorry too, but Catherine wants to eat. Gregor asks for a drink. As if she hadn't heard, Catherine answers, "If you've come to make love to Catherine, you won't get away with it. Mummy didn't allow Catherine to kiss men. Men don't see, they steal angel. Catherine was told not to speak to the men." Putting her diaries on the shelf, Catherine continues, "Did you bring Mummy's books? Are you very good? What's your name?" Gregor speaks up. Catherine asks, "Are you a vet? The goat has something wrong. She's not giving much milk." "What am I going to feed Angela? Cure my goat?" Gregor says he is not a specialist, but if the animal needs treatment, he will try to call a vet. Catherine poured time on the inside. After drinking tea, the woman says, "Man, you don't have any warm wool socks." Catherine pulls a pair of wool socks out of the wardrobe and gives them to Gregory. He, of course, doesn't dare refuse. Catherine accompanies the guest to the gate. Gregor was about to wander off, but the woman catches up with him and gasps, tugging on his sleeve. Gregor returns to the hotel. The room is empty. The family has gone to enjoy the mountains. 2 suspicious-looking men are sitting in a car, following the American through binoculars. One of the stalkers calls someone. "The professor has just arrived. You've been busting around the mountains." A voice on the phone says, "Where's his wife? Where are the children?" "The devil knows them. They're not back yet." The voice, "Tomorrow evening, I'm expecting a report. What these Americans are doing, who they are meeting, when they sleep, eat, drink, and when they fuck. All clear? Answer?" The situation of the woman in question is complicated. She does not have an identity document, and there is no such person in the country at all. So Gregor decides to initiate Peter Lem from Salzburg into the mystery. If it had not been for Peter's invitation, Gregor would not have come here in the first place. Gregorio's account of the lethargic patient and the footage he shot are considered by Lem to be a huge scientific sensation. But after unpicking the finer points of the historical fact, Peter agrees that the discovery should not be made public yet. He promises to help Gregor with the transport of the lethargic to the USA. At the end of his holiday in Austria, Gregor decides to send the family back to their home country, and he is left to wait for the paperwork necessary for the lethargic woman's departure to be processed. Meanwhile, the same 2 strangers are following the Schonecker family. When they find an opportunity, they entangle Gregoris's daughter Christina in an unpleasant situation. The girl is in urgent need of help, so the cheeky siblings, who are also American and play the good guy liberators, go to meet Jane, who does not suspect their evil intentions. Calling their bosses, the strangers consider what to do since the Schonecker children and wife are in their hands. The chef orders, "This is not the time for extreme measures." In her farewell speech, Jane even thanks her compatriots for their help. On Sunday, Gregor says goodbye to his family, and on Monday he and Lem organize the retrieval of a lethargic patient from the mountains. They do not tell the helicopter pilot the specific location of this mystical cave, nor do they reveal what happened to this young woman in the Alps. The lethargic patient is brought to the Peter Lem Clinic for the start. Peter promises to get the necessary paperwork for the lethargic patient within a week. The travel passport of one of the clinic's patients is used for this purpose. Aware that he is committing an unlawful act, almost a crime, Peter nevertheless decides preserving a scientific sensation is more important than the possible sanctions against him. At the beginning of June, Gregor Schonecker flies to New York. On the same plane, a lethargy patient, Angel, is flown to the States. 1. New York, Suffolk, Dix Hills. Someone is watching the Schonecker house through binoculars. Jane's phone rings. It's Gregor calling from the plane to say he's on his way. Jane urges the children to hurry to Kennedy International Airport to meet their father. Jane, Christine, and Carl get into the Toyota and drive out of the yard onto the paved street. At that moment, an empty taxi, which had been idling nearby, pulls up behind them. There are no other cars in sight, and Jane presses the accelerator. Suddenly, a black Hummer pulls out from the side of the road and crashes into Jane's car. Fortunately, none of the family trio is injured. Jane gets out in a huff. At the same time, a woman in her 30s gets out of the Hummer. She is dazed from the impact and has a scratch on her forehead. A taxi driver stops and says he can testify in Jane's favor that the driver of the SUV was at fault for the accident. The woman, who has covered the wound with a handkerchief, admits in good faith that she was the culprit. The woman begs Jane not to go to the police because she does not have a driving license and is in danger of getting into trouble. She is afraid of her husband's harsh reaction, and besides, what will the insurance company say? The culprit promises to compensate Jane for the damage to her car. She says that she lives in the Nassau area in Plainview, which is just a mile from the 495 motorway, just on the way to the airport. So she has a couple of $1,000 in cash at home if a taxi driver will give her a lift. With the approval of her daughter and son, Jane agrees to help a stressed woman in good faith. After leaving her battered Toyota in the yard, Jane and the children get into a taxi. The taxi will first stop at the home of the woman who caused the accident and then take them to Kennedy Airport. The Hummer is in front, the taxi follows behind. Soon the cars pull into a secluded courtyard. Suddenly, the taxi dives into a dark hangar and stops inside. It is strange to see the perpetrator of the accident walk up to the taxi driver and start to grope him, muttering, "Will you be happy with some kind of pay?" The shameless public licking makes Jane and the children feel uncomfortable, especially since the wound on the woman's forehead is somehow no longer visible. Not satisfied with this comedy, the whole family gets out of the taxi. Meanwhile, two men suddenly appear from around a dark corner. Jane recognizes the same helpful Americans who came to her daughter's aid in Austria. The first one sarcastically says, "Well, here we are. Did I tell you in Europe that this is not the last time we will see each other?" Jane says indignantly, "What does that mean?" The second one roughly grabs her by the hair. "You'd better not make a peep, dear worldlings." The children are confused. Christina is shaking with nervous tremors, and Carl is instinctively clinging to his mother. Demonstrating the gun in her hand, the perpetrator of the accident taunts, "As long as there are stupid naifs like you in the world, there will be ingenious criminals like us." After the documents, mobile phones, and other personal belongings have been taken away, the abductees are locked in a dark, windowless room. Meanwhile, Gregor is greeted by Furman after his flight. The assistant doesn't know where the chef's wife and children are. He hasn't even noticed them. Gregor calls his family, but all their mobiles are out of range. Gregor decides to wait at the airport. The patient, flown from Europe, is taken to a clinic in Queens. When his mobile rings, Gregor picks up the receiver, hoping it's his family, but he hears a stranger's voice. "Dear doctor, your wife and children are in our care. If you really love them, then remember the first condition: do not try to contact law enforcement. And you will hear our second condition in the near future." Gregor tries to explain the reason for the family's abduction, but the receiver beeps. 2. Gregor can't find a place for himself. The next day, the kidnappers call again. Their second condition is ultimatum. Within 7 days, Gregor must hand over his invention, the whale therapy equipment, and all technological documentation. Gregor is undecided whether to report the kidnapping to law enforcement. Klaus, who raised Gregor from an early age, is also under stress. As the old man's health deteriorates and the symptoms of the year's burden worsen, Klaus is admitted to a clinic ward. And Gregor doesn't want to be alone at home, so he spends the night in the clinic. With the old man's approval, Gregor does get in touch with the FBI. When the officers arrive, they cannot understand what is so special about the equipment that the criminals who want to seize it are willing to use such drastic methods. Gregor, too, does not understand the real reason. His assistant, when questioned about the insolent German interests, is also unable to explain. Gregor recalls a case of a patient who accidentally overdosed on wave therapy and became overly expressive, finding it difficult to control his body movements. It was a good thing that the patient, who was not familiar with his surroundings, easily obeyed the doctor's voice, as if he had been trained. So Gregor hypothesizes that the criminal's interest in his invention may be due to its unstudied effects on the mental and physical state of patients. But how did they find out about the undesirable properties of medical equipment? Gregor shares with the officers his suspicions that Furman was involved. FBI officer BM decides to interview Schonecker's assistant. A lethargic patient admitted to the clinic is temporarily forgotten because Gregor is too concerned about the fate of his family. Meanwhile, Klaus takes a nostalgic interest in a patient brought back from Austria. He asks everyone about the unique patient, but no one tells him the truth. Klaus wonders why even his favorite Gregor avoids talking about the circumstances of the patient's arrival. Klaus is not allowed to walk, so the old man seeks an opportunity to visit the mystery patient's ward. A deep night. 7%. Klaus can't fall asleep. He slips out into the corridor and down the stairs to find himself next to a ward where a woman is laid up, neither alive nor dead. He slips in unnoticed. The ward is very hot, and for some reason the extra condensation has been switched on. Klaus creeps closer. He switches on the bedside lamp and almost falls asleep when he sees the patient's face. In a cold sweat, Klaus sits on the edge of the bed. He nods. Esther? The eternally young, phenomenal Esther. Klaus, as if in a frenzy, embraces the sick woman's body, touching her hands, her hair, her face, her lips. His memory takes him back to World War II. As if Esther can hear him, Klaus begins his painful confession. March 1941, Salzburg. On that memorable Sunday evening, Klaus saw Esther for the first time. It was raining heavily, and the spring wind was blowing fiercely. Klaus and his 5-year-old son Robert were driving home in the company car. Suddenly, Robert shouted, "Dad, stop! There's a little kid in there!" When Klaus noticed a woman walking in the opposite direction with a baby in her arms, he slammed on the brakes and reversed slightly. After catching up with the woman, he opened the car door and invited her inside. The woman looked at him askance, but when she saw the smiling little boy, she got in. The charming black-haired woman, aged about 25, was carrying her 1-year-old daughter. Both were soaking wet. The woman said she was in a hurry to get home because the child, who had been left with a babysitter, was acutely ill and had a high fever. Klaus offered to give her a lift. Later he said, "Let's show the sick little one to a pediatrician who lives nearby." The doctor examined the baby and gave her medication. Klaus refused to let the woman pay for the visit, claiming that the doctor owed him money for a different kind of service. On the way home, the woman said she was Esther, and her daughter's name was Lara. She works as an English teacher in a grammar school. Klaus asked Esther where her husband was. Why was a young, charming woman walking alone in the rain with a baby? Esther replied that her husband was working late. And when Esther asked about Klaus's occupation, he just said, "Let's keep his job a secret for now." He only mentioned that he had been widowed for a couple of years, and that he was raising his son alone. After pointing out where to stop, Esther got out and thanked him for his sincere help. As Klaus drove away, he noticed in his rearview mirror that Esther was leaving the courtyard where her apartment was supposedly located and running across the street. So Esther's place of residence is not the luxurious brickwork she indicated saying goodbye? Why did she lie? Klaus turned the car around and went back. He got out and looked around. Not a single person was visible. There was an anti-Nazi leaflet taped to the fence. Angry, Klaus tore it off and tore it into shreds. At night, Klaus couldn't sleep, and Esther wouldn't leave his head. The next day, SS officer Klaus Schonecker is posted to Austria from Bavaria. He is from Munich. He called his subordinates and scolded them severely. During the night, Jewish proclamations had been noticed again, so he gave orders to find and arrest the enemies of the Reich, the producers of the proclamations, as soon as possible. The next day, Klaus met Esther outside the gymnasium. He was sitting in the official car, wearing his SS officer's uniform, because he wanted to make the deepest possible impression on the woman. Unfortunately, the wait was futile, and Esther never showed up. But Klaus, who had lost his head to a charming woman, was persistent. For several days, he drove down the same street where he dropped Esther off that day. Finally, one evening, he saw her. Climbing out of his luck, Klaus opened the car door and greeted her graciously. But great disappointment followed, as Esther flatly refused a lift on the grounds that she had a spouse and was a faithful wife. In the face of this miserable failure, Klaus cursed himself for having fallen hopelessly in love with a married woman. A few days later, Klaus fell for Esther again. When Esther saw her pursuer, she ran across the street. Klaus's body shook with rage. He was tormented by his thirst to hold the beautiful woman in his arms. Late in the evening, an officer on duty reported to SS Unit Commander Schonecker that the sleuths had picked up the trail of the wanted leaflet maker Blumenzon, a former Viennese opera singer nicknamed Baritone. Klaus ordered that this time the insolent adversary not be released. That night, a group of SS men stormed into a wooden barrack and caught Blumenzon red-handed. But Klaus was surprised by a contradictory surprise. His wife, the beautiful Esther, came out to defend the criminal, a Jew by nationality. Her little daughter screamed, while the woman of Klaus's dreams pleaded for mercy with a look of confusion. But when he remembered Esther's categorical refusal to have friendly contact with him, Klaus felt a flame of revenge in his eyes. So Klaus decided to become a strict enforcer of the law against this Jewish family. After calling Blumenzon obscene names in front of Esther, he ordered the criminal to be arrested and thrown in the gallows. Klaus felt slighted. Perhaps this is why he was actively involved in proving Blumenzon's guilt. In addition, Esther had lied to him. She had long been dismissed from the gymnasium because of her Jewish background. However, a few days later, Esther suddenly volunteered to be taken in by SS leader Schonecker. Entering Klaus's office, Esther began to plead for help for her unfortunate family. SS officer Klaus was arrogant. As Esther stood right next to him, Klaus could hear the woman's breathing and smell the fresh aroma of her hair. Somewhat unexpectedly, Esther knelt down in front of Klaus and kissed his hands. "I'll do anything you want," she wailed. Klaus's heart squeezed hard. At that moment, Klaus is brought back to reality. He is not an SS officer, but an old sick man, sitting in a ward next to young Esther. Suddenly, the sleeping woman's hand stirs. Her fingers suddenly squeeze Klaus's hand. The old man suffers a violent shock. His eyes glaze over and he falls unconscious. Gregor wakes up with some anxiety. He gets up and opens the door to the ward where the old man is admitted. Unbelievably, his bed is empty. Gregor looks around the ancillary rooms. Klaus is nowhere to be seen. As he passes by the lethargic ward, Gregor's attention is drawn to a light on. Did the nurse forget to turn it off? He suddenly sees the old man lying in bed. The fact that the lethargic woman's arm is hanging down from the bed looks strange. The resuscitation team concludes that Klaus has suffered a deep stroke and has little chance of survival. In the intensive care unit, Klaus is connected to medical equipment. But Gregor doesn't understand why the old man has come to the lethargic ward at night and why he is here had a life-threatening seizure. And after this unfortunate incident, Gregoris is still trying to keep going. He decides not to delay the treatment of the lethargic woman with wave therapy. If the criminals have to give up this machine, it won't be long before similar medical equipment is produced. After a few sessions of treatment, there is hardly any change in the patient's condition. However, the woman's body temperature has risen slightly. Is she coming back to life? Gregor argues to FBI officer BM that he is not going to risk his family, so he will soon turn over the medical equipment to the criminals. However, the kidnappers suddenly announce that they are temporarily postponing the takeover of the equipment. they mysteriously threaten Gregor to think about further communication. When asked about his relatives, Gregor replies that he would rather pray for God's help than seek the intercession of the FBI. Gregor's hostile actions could cost him dearly. Gregor becomes convinced that the criminals are quite aware of his joint plans with the FBI. But who is a criminal informant? Is it Furman? Time is running out, but there is no word from the criminals. To compensate for his losses, Gregor takes an active role in the treatment of a lethargic woman. After a week, she begins to change for the better. Her body temperature rises slightly, her pulse quickens. One day, a miracle even happens. The patient's fingers shake during a session. A week into intensive therapy, the woman's lips seem to be trying to say something. Isn't this a major breakthrough? Is wave therapy really a revolutionary invention? 4. Klaus has been in a coma for over a week, but one morning his consciousness starts to recover, and he makes some small contacts with reality. Klaus sees Esther again. There she is in the ward bed, her eyes closed, her body cold, and her face pale. Esther is as stunningly beautiful as when he first saw her in Salzburg. Klaus thinks that Esther smiled, and her hand gently touched his arm. Klaus's eyes widen with the strong impression. He wants to turn over in the ward bed, but he can barely move his fingers. What's wrong with him? Is he paralyzed? Klaus's mind wanders back to the war. Then, in the office of SS officer Klaus Schonecker, Esther fell to her knees in front of him. She kissed his hands and begged him to save Michael. But Klaus lifted her up and would not let her lower herself. Still not recovering from his self-loathing, Klaus asked Mrs. Blumenson to leave. But when a desperate Esther opened the door, Klaus changed his mind and asked her to return. Esther came in trembling, a spark of hope shining in her tearful eyes. And Klaus was desperate to punish the woman for the fact that the friendship he had just offered her had been rejected, even for the first time. So, playing the part of the exuberant, he said, "Okay, Mrs. Blumenson, I'll think about it, and I'll be waiting for you tonight at 11 o'clock in the same place where you got out of my car that night." That evening, Esther humbly gave herself to Klaus. Although the SS officer was aware of the reason for Esther Blumenson's submission, the possession of the most desirable woman gave him a sense of pride in his official position. Of course, in his heart, Klaus felt madly in love with Esther, but he tried to repress his tender romantic feelings in order to satisfy his frantic physical passion. Klaus's consciousness gave birth to contradictory feelings of pathetic superiority towards a woman who had broken her vows of loyalty to her spouse. So Klaus, without remorse, decided to take advantage of Esther's powerlessness. Not daring to appear in public with a Jewish woman, Klaus contented himself with clandestine trysts. The lovers met only at night, once or twice a week. Each time, Esther persuaded Klaus to free her husband, but Klaus was only interested in being able to enjoy the woman's proximity alone and not share it with anyone, not even her husband. After all, releasing Blumenson would not only undermine Klaus's position as a high-ranking Reich official, it would put him in real danger of losing Esther. Thus, in Klaus's subconscious, the baritone became not so much a dangerous criminal for the Reich, but a hostage to Klaus's inexorable love for Esther, and a guarantor of his secret trysts with his mistress. A couple of months later, Esther announced that she was pregnant, and Klaus, while accepting the news rejoicing, he casually remarked to Esther that it might not be the fruit of his seed. Esther was deeply offended, went into hiding, and never showed up for a date. But when Klaus threatened in a letter that Michael would be immediately transported to a concentration camp, Esther was forced to obey and remain a tool for Klaus's hidden lusts. At the end of Esther's 7th month of pregnancy, Klaus finally decided to answer her pleas. The release of the baritone was a rather selfish, well-thought-out calculation by Klaus. If the husband saw his wife with a distended belly, thanks to no effort of his, he would feel terribly humiliated and would turn away from Esther for good. But for all that, Klaus gave Blumenson a strict condition. He would have to disappear from Austria on the same day as his freedom. Organizing a criminal's escape was a risky endeavor, and Klaus must do it without witnesses. He gives Blumenson a handwritten letter from his wife, in which she persuades Michael to be prepared to escape because of the high ransom. However, for this purpose, the husband would have to confess immediately that it was he who had produced the anti-Nazi leaflets. So Klaus put Blumensohn in the car and drove him a few dozen kilometers from Salzburg. He wrote a report on a testimony about an offset printing press that had allegedly been operating in one of the recently burnt Jewish houses. On the way back, Klaus stopped and allowed Baraton to escape. On his return to Salzburg, he specifically drove the car into a fence. He reportedly lost consciousness in the accident, and the perpetrator took the opportunity to escape. For this offense, Schoenecker was given a warning by his superiors and threatened with demotion. But more important to Klaus was the fact that when Michael left the country, Esther would give birth to Klaus's baby, and thus would not be able to disappear anywhere from Salzburg. Number 5. The criminals order Gregoris to sign a contract to sell equipment to Europe. Only when the container is intercepted by reliable freight forwarders will Schoenecker get his family back. Gregoris immediately complies with the criminals' demands. He does not report the transfer of the equipment to the FBI, so there is no problem with the kidnappers this time, and he finally gets his wife and children back. But from that moment on, the kidnappers disappear like water. In a stressful situation, Gregor is at a loss as to what to do and is overwhelmed by his failures. He is not happy that the lethargic patient is improving and seems to be returning to life. Suddenly, Gregor remembers Catherine, the Alpine loner. A bad premonition enters his mind. It's almost 4 weeks since the lethargic woman was taken from her mysterious abode in the cave. Gregor calls Peter Lem in Salzburg and asks him to pay an urgent visit to Catherine, who has devotedly nursed the patient for decades. How did she react when she no longer found her angel in the sarcophagus? Gregor feels heartless, having deprived the recluse of the meaning of her life. On Saturday afternoon, Lem and a colleague arrive at the site. As they approach a farmhouse, their eyes are drawn to the frightened sheep scattered across the fields. Catherine's loose wolfhound furiously attacks the aliens, and Peter's companion is forced to stab it. Smelling the stench of rotting flesh, the men find a goat carcass that has been horribly eviscerated. It appears to have been made by a dog. A little further on, a freshly slaughtered sheep is found. A starving wolf dog seems to have devoured all the sheep one by one. Inside, as if after a pogrom, the men are astonished to find things scattered, sofas smashed and furniture broken. The men realize that in her desperation, the woman could have killed herself. It is clear that Catherine has been away from the village for some time, so the men decide to look for her in the mountains. After a call to Gregor, Peter refines the mountain route on foot. After a grueling climb, the mystical cave is discovered. Once inside, the silence is deafening, with only the trickle of the spring echoing through the vaults. When the kerosene lamps are lit, Peter exclaims, "Look, there she is!" And indeed, Catherine is lying in the sarcophagus, covered by a glass shroud, looking as if she is no longer alive. When the hood is removed, Peter checks her pulse. Although her heartbeat is extremely weak, she appears to be alive. Wasn't the gray-haired woman trying to identify with Angela? In desperation, she seems to have committed a brutal suicide, dying of cold, hunger, and thirst. Peter says, "My body really would not have endured all these days." Isn't that a miracle? It is decided to call in a rescue helicopter to help. In a Salzburg hospital, Catherine is lifted to her feet. Gregor proposes that the woman be flown to America so that he can treat her as a mental patient. Moreover, the discovery of the angel will calm Catherine's wounded soul and give her a reason and meaning to live again. Peter promises to prepare Catherine for the trip and to find people to look after Catherine's homestead, even in this complicated situation. Once found, he takes Catherine's mother's diaries. They must be preserved. Number 6. A nurse breaks the news. The lethargy patient is awake. Gregor Tekin runs to the ward. Angel lies there with her eyes closed, but her lips are repeating, "Michael, Michael." Perhaps the woman is calling for her spouse? The patient does not respond to his attempts to speak to her, but Gregor feels he is very close to a great professional achievement. With no contact with the kidnappers, Gregor fears he has lost the chance to save family. When the FBI contacts BM again, he is reproached by the FBI. The head of the family is guilty of succumbing to criminal pressure. The only option now seems to be to wait for the kidnapper's mercy. Meanwhile, Gregorio's assistant applies for temporary leave. But Furman doesn't sit idly by. At the criminal base, he trains specialists, introducing them to the intricacies of the Schenecker machine. But Dan and Kurt still do not trust Furman, who betrayed his employer. Soon they also find out about Furman's interrogation at the FBI headquarters in New York, but for some reason the assistant has covered it up. When they try to interrogate Furman, he does not reveal the truth. Although Furman feels he is a very important partner who knows many secrets, one day the neo-Nazi coordinators decide to get rid of him too. Furman's trainees forcibly connect their teacher to the machine. After receiving a massive dose of waves, Furman falls into a deep hypnotic sleep. When night falls, he is taken back to his home. In the morning, Furman wakes up from his sleep completely changed, dependent on a commanding voice, obediently obeying the commands recorded by neo-Nazis. Like a rabid vandal, he goes on a rampage, breaking everything, throwing it away until the house is no longer a place to live. But his rampage doesn't end there. Furmanas goes on a rampage in the stairwell of the apartment building, breaking neighbors' doors, smashing window panes, and destroying everything in sight. Much larger men try to stop him, but without success. No one understands the reason why an intelligent, small-built neighbor is overcome by such a diabolical force. When the police arrive, Furman barricades himself in the flat. Meanwhile, the monitor is broadcasting the instruction. "Don't give in! Turn off the gas and blow up the house right now!" Without even thinking, Furman obeys the order, turn off the gas oven tap. As the gas floods into the apartment, Furman clicks the lighter's burner. Soon after, a fiery explosion rocks the apartment building. Furman burns to death, screaming hysterically in the flames. Nearby, Dan and Kurt watch with ironic smiles. Gregor is called to the scene. He argues that the assistant was probably the real traitor, and that it is therefore symbolic that he himself was the victim of an arbitrary medical experiment. Gregor receives an ironic fax message. "We are grateful to Furman for his contribution. This weakling was killed by a foolish metamorphosis. The traitor who betrayed his boss later took on the role of his boss's protector. So, Shauna Carey, from now on your conscience will be tortured by conflicting feelings. Should you be relieved to finally be rid of this insidious scoundrel, or should you mourn the fate of this innocent suicide?" This suicide-like murder only deepened Gregorio's grief over the fate of his wife and children. It seems that criminals are determined to do anything. Catherine arrives in the States for treatment. Gregor decides to take in a woman with a mental disability so that she can help with the housework. After a painful cry, she accuses Gregor of stealing Angela. Gregor tries to console her. Angel is recovering and Catherine will be with her again. Meanwhile, the lethargic woman's health is clearly improving. She is opening her eyes and trying to speak German, Hebrew, English. She is partially paralyzed, her muscles and joints are atrophied, and intensive therapy is being attempted. For the time being, the patient is unable to walk, so she is placed in a wheelchair. The patient has difficulty finding her place, is not aware that she has entered another era, is unaware of reality in her situation. In fact, she tells the staff that she is Esther Blumenzon, 27 years old. When she touches her belly, she is surprised. Where is her newborn? Esther talks about her 2-year-old daughter, Laura. At night, the patient no longer sleeps, only a strange state of wakefulness. To avoid stressing the patient, the staff explains the most basic things to her thoroughly. The hardest part is telling the patient the truth about the lethargy that has deprived her of the real world for decades. Esther doesn't believe that she is not really 27 but 60 years older, even though her face and body appear physically unchanged. So the staff joke that Esther is the world's youngest old woman. The lethargic woman is introduced to the realities of the present day and is read to in print publications and books. Esther is particularly shocked by television. On sleepless nights, she cannot take her eyes off the greatest miracle in the world. The psychiatric clinic is under attack by the intrusive media, but Gregor shies away from interviews about lethargy and keeps the fact of his family's abduction a complete secret. One morning, Esther rolls into the doctor's office in a wheelchair. She asks a surprised Gregor if the clinic staff are telling the truth about his family being kidnapped. Although it is strange that the patient asks very personal questions, Gregor confirms the matter. Esther suddenly declares that she probably knows the location of his wife and children, and can even draw the location. Taking a blank sheet of paper, Esther returns a good hour later with a drawing of 3 people, a woman and 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, surrounded by cargo ships. How does the sick woman know the composition of the doctor's family? The area in the drawing resembles a seaport. Whose joke is this? Puzzled, Gregor asks if the drawing was really in the woman's imagination. Esther admits that she was not a talented draughtswoman, and she is quite surprised that she was able to draw so beautifully an image that she had dreamt with her eyes open. The most important thing, according to Esther, is the nagging inner feeling that tonight I need to be in that place she has painted. It is imperative to hurry, because tomorrow the situation could change irreversibly. Gregor urgently contacts the FBI. After faxing the drawing, BM calls an hour later. This appears to be a redrawing of photographic footage of the Staten Island port terminal. My colleagues on Richmond Tour recognize Shooter's Island in the greenery, visible in the background of the fucking drawing. And what to do now? We are not telepaths. In this case, I would advise you to check your source of information. In Esther's ward, the only things you find are medical brochures and New York weekly newspapers, which do not include pictures of the port terminal. Gregor decides to resort to a meager but possibly prophetic imagination, especially as Esther is a unique person. She stands out from billions of people. Towards evening, Gregor and Esther get into an ambulance and drive to the Staten Island port terminal. Lethargic finds herself outside the clinic for the first time. The modern megalopolis, the expression of civilization, blinds the patient, and she is unable to regain her sense of reality. Finding that specific place before it gets dark is essential. After scouting a few blocks, Gregor asks the driver to stop at a position where Shooter's Island can be seen. To Gregor's surprise, the binoculars reveal Esther's carefully painted cargo ship. It's incredible, simply mystical. Has the lethargic woman really acquired phenomenal properties? The hours tick by. Soon it will be dark. There is still no movement in the harbor area. Gregor realizes that there is little hope of seeing his loved ones. But just before midnight, a taxi pulls into the port area. It stops next to the same painted ship. Another car arrives, a Hummer SUV. Gregor's nerves are on edge. Is it coming true? The prophecy of the lethargic woman? Nearby, a heartbreaking scene unfolds as Gregor's wife, daughter, and son are led out one by one, handcuffed, as the ship's gangway descends. All 3 are put into a taxi. The kidnappers discuss something, then get into the cars. The situation is desperate, and Gregor feels completely helpless. He calls the FBI duty officer and explains the situation. The officer promises to send a car. The taxi with the kidnapped men moves. Gregor urges his driver to keep up and comments on his mobile phone to the FBI officer on the exact route through the streets. As a kidnapper in a taxi drives across the Verrazano-Warros Bridge towards Brooklyn, he informs his insiders that they are being followed by a medical car. The hope that they will soon be rescued immediately shines in the eyes of Schonecker's wife. A voice on the receiver tells the kidnappers that if this apparent nonsense turns out to be real, then Plan B will come into effect. When the FBI car finally shows up, it starts chasing a taxi, which suddenly takes the same route back from where it came. At full speed, the cars cross the same bridge and end up in the same area of the harbor. Once inside the illuminated square, the taxi throws itself between hundreds of stacked containers. The FBI officers, catching up with the kidnappers, seem to stop them. But suddenly the unforeseen happens. A container hanging from a crane boom suddenly breaks loose and crushes an FBI car. Meanwhile, a little further on, the door of one of the containers opens and the taxi plunges inside, thus getting rid of its pursuers. A police crew arrives and finds nothing but a wrecked FBI car and fatally injured officers at the dump site. Gregor's failure to free his family is his greatest criticism. 8. Gregor suspects that the perpetrators are keeping his wife and children for a specific reason. After gathering his patience, Gregor decides to wait. When he arrives at the clinic, BM wants to question the author of the drawings, but Gregor protests. Intrusiveness can only worsen the condition of his patient. Meanwhile, after a week of vigorous exercise, Esther is able to walk on her own, without the help of staff. She also paints another dream picture. The sheet of paper shows the facade of Gregorio's house quite accurately, and the woman sweeping the yard resembles Catherine. Gregor realizes that the patient has acquired unique qualities, but does not say what the house is or what the woman looks like. Gregor frequently visits the lethargic woman to learn more about the supernaturally empowered man. As if in passing, he mentions to the patient Klaus, an old man who has suffered a stroke. No therapy, no pharmaceuticals can help the paralyzed body. Esther expresses her desire to visit the unfortunate man, to be by his side, to pray, to meditate. Esther no longer uses a wheelchair. When she arrives at the ward, she looks in and recognizes Klaus. Although his body is lying still, his eyes immediately brighten up when he sees Esther rising from her lethargy. However, after the stroke, Klaus's face is paralyzed and slightly distorted, so he can't show any emotions, and his mouth can't utter a word. Meanwhile, Esther, left alone with Klaus, is immersed in the memories of 60 years. Salzburg, January 1942. Esther knew that Klaus Schonecker's promise to free Michael was imminent, so she waited for her husband every day and night. As she felt her round belly, Esther thought about what she would say to her lover about the pregnancy. An unbearable sin was weighing on her soul, but she was not going to lie to her husband, even though the truth would be too harsh for his self-esteem and the Jewish mentality in general. It is indeed a pity that her baby will have German, that is to say, Nazi, blood, which is incompatible with the anti-fascist Blumenzon's beliefs. At night, Esther heard a knock at the window. Had her husband finally returned? But no, it was Dietrich Leutzel, Michael's colleague at the Vienna Opera. He gestured for Esther to go outside. He announced that Michael was already at large, that the family needed to pack up and leave immediately, and that Michael is currently at his house, waiting for Esther and her daughter to arrive. Esther didn't wait a minute. She immediately decided to escape with her husband. She placed the sleeping Clara in Dietrich's arms. Taking 2 pairs of skis with him, he limped off. Soon after, Esther took the rest of the essentials for the journey to Dietrich. The meeting between Esther and Michael was extremely sensual, and they did not let go of each other's warm embrace for a long time. Dietrich had his own car. He took pity on his Jewish family and promised to help them escape the fascist persecution. Michael had thought to seek temporary refuge with an old friend who lived in a remote corner on the southern side of the Venediger Ridge. Morning was still a long way off. After loading their luggage into the car, the Blumenson family left Salzburg. For good measure, Dietrich lent Michael his hunting rifle. The road was covered with snow, so Dietrich's car was slow to move forward. After a couple of 100 kilometers, the car began to sneeze and stumble and soon broke down, so the Blumensons had to continue their journey on foot. They put their daughter on a sledge and both parents got on skis. When Esther had the chance, she tried to tell her husband about the shameful grudge of forced infidelity, but Michael gently put his hand over her mouth. "Darling, this is not the time to explain. I've already noticed your physical changes. Besides, that German SS officer threw more than one hurtful hint. Believe me, you are just a victim." Michael and Esther were good skiers, so it was a pleasure to skate in the beginning. With a fairly accurate map of the Alps, you didn't have to blindly rely on intuition. Avoiding the pursuers, the family skied the dangerous alpine route, as it would have been unwise to take the normal paths through the gorges. The climb was exhausting, and the pregnant woman was overcome by fatigue, so they were delighted to find a lonely grove in the evening. They did not hesitate long before visiting the welcoming people. They fed the Blumensons and gave them a place to stay for the night, without any payment. The fugitives got up before dawn and put their skis back on and hit the road. The Blumensons faced the toughest part of the high mountains. At dawn, the Blumensons' ears were suddenly filled with human voices. "It's an alarm. What if the SS catches up with them?" The family picked up the pace. But no matter how fast they hurried, the frightening sounds kept coming. It was snowing heavily, so it was impossible to see who was chasing them. Suddenly, nearby, there was a "Stop, or we will be forced to shoot." The family had nowhere to live. Of course, the idea of hoping for the grace of the pursuers seemed quite reasonable. But the principled Michael decided otherwise. Esther and her daughter should try to escape, while he would try to distract his pursuers. Michael's resolve was unwavering, and there was no time to change his mind. After waking up with his wife and daughter, Michael prepared himself to die, but not to surrender to the fascists. Dragging her sleeping daughter in the sleigh, Esther shuffled away. Conflicting thoughts tormented her. Would it be better to give up? Would the concentration camp and the gas chamber not threaten the family? Suddenly, Esther heard two shots, one after the other. It seemed to be Michael's hunting rifle. Immediately, a return burst of automatic weapons was heard. Immediately afterwards, there was silence, a deathly silence. Esther's heart was gripped by a terrible premonition. In desperation, Esther resolved to go back, and so be it as God had decreed. At that point, Esther no longer cared how the beastly SS men would treat her. If her beloved was dead, it seemed pointless to stay alive. Esther turned back. Through the veil of falling snow, she saw three uniformed silhouettes. It was Klaus Schonecker, accompanied by two armed SS men. Fresh blood marks were visible in the snow. Esther's throat choked with sobs. "Where's Michael?" she screamed. But Klaus, as if taking the blame for the woman's anguish, kept his head down. The uniformed SS men taunted. "Look for your husband on the slalom course. He turns out to be a fearless downhill skier." Esther was shocked when she realized that Michael was injured and was going to bleed to death. Klaus leaving the sleigh in which her little daughter Clara was sweetly sleeping, Esther resolved to go ahead without fear of consequences pregnant. She decided to blindly ski down the mountain, with her husband trailing behind. Large snowflakes were drifting, and the poor visibility made it impossible to see anything. But Esther, determined to do everything, was speeding along. The downhill seemed so long that it didn't seem to have end. Michael's tracks had completely disappeared, and it was hard to see where the skis were taking her. Off balance, barely able to keep her bearings, Esther suddenly felt the ground slipping away. Suddenly, a rock loomed in front of her, and it was impossible to avoid a collision. 9. After this episode of reminiscing, Esther returns to reality. At one point, it appears to her that it is not the sick Klaus who is lying in the ward, but a uniformed SS officer, Schonecker, who invites her in with a lustful smile. What era is it in? It's hard to believe she hasn't been around for 60 years. Is this the same Klaus Schonecker, the essayist in love with her, who once got her pregnant? Suddenly it dawns on Esther that she has given birth to their baby and that her child is somewhere nearby. Esther, not expecting this, goes mad. She cuts the wires to the machines Klaus is connected to. The alarm immediately goes off. The medical staff arrives and tries to hold the lethargic woman, but she keeps shaking the stroke-stricken old man and screaming in German, "Get up, Klaus! Can you hear me? Get up!" Staff are trying to rescue the patient. But at a fateful moment they stop dead in their tracks. The paralyzed patient, clinging to Esther's arm, is getting out of bed. When Gregor arrives, he sees the apparent miracle of the old man, who had just been in a coma, now standing on his own 2 feet, smiling with his mouth full, almost posing. It seems that this clinic is not a healing process, but a sorcerous seance. And indeed, Klaus's resurrection poses a riddle that is beyond the ken of not only Gregory, but also medical science. Gregor decides to take Esther to his house because Catherine, Esther's daughter, is staying there and will be delighted to finally have her angel back. However, Gregor is a little worried. What if Esther shakes off the care of the woman who is quacking? When Esther gets out of the car at Gregorio's house, there is a deafening screech, which is Catherine's reaction to the angel's performance. However, Gregor is silent about the fact that Catherine is Esther's daughter. 4 people sit down for dinner. Klaus would like to confess his dog work for the SS, for which he spent years in prison, but hasn't found the courage yet. In the silence of the night, Klaus's thoughts go back to the old days. As an SS officer, Klaus took a considerable risk in releasing Esther's husband. He could have been immediately exposed by his colleagues. To leave others in no doubt, he himself ordered the police to mobilize to search for the criminal Blumenzon. So, from early in the morning, SS troops blocked the roads leading out of Salzburg. Klaus Schonecker did not allow anyone to inspect the Blumenzons' home. He had the idea to visit Esther himself, but when he knocked on the door, no one let him in. Klaus didn't like the sound of footsteps outside the door. How dare Esther behave so inappropriately? With suspicion in his heart, Klaus ordered the Blumenzons to break into the house, but it was empty. Klaus, realizing that he had been deceived, was furious. After all, Esther was much more than a tool to satisfy his sexual whims. Klaus saw the pregnant woman's escape as a betrayal, a violation of his caring guardianship. After calling the neighbors, the SS investigators received information that the Blumenson family had taken shelter during the night. Someone complained about Dietrich Leutzel, a colleague of the baritone and an opera soloist, who lived nearby. Dietrich's mother was called and found out that her son had left in his own car. Knowing the number plates, it was possible to find the car, so Dietrich was arrested in the afternoon. During his interrogation and torture, the SS officers learned that the Blumenzon family was escaping through Venediger. Dietrich was forced to go with the pursuers and to pinpoint the start of the fugitives' route as precisely as possible. Klaus understood why the Blumenzons decided to take the risky route over the ridge. They thought that no one would dare chase them down the slippery high mountain paths. But Klaus's self-esteem was stronger than any rationality. He had no doubt that, no matter how hard it was, the fugitives would have to be stopped. The trophy he believes he has been unjustly robbed of, the pregnant beauty Esther, must be recovered. To catch up, Klaus and 2 soldiers skied all night. In the mountains, the owners of the discovered farmhouse tried to deny sheltering a Jewish family, but in the face of reprisals, they admitted sheltering a man, a pregnant woman, and their baby daughter. The ride lasted until dawn. The pursuers realized that the fugitives were somewhere nearby by the fresh tracks of skis. Klaus fell behind as the soldiers picked up the pace. Suddenly, a skier, Blumenzon, skied past Klaus. With a contemptuous glance in Klaus's direction, the fugitive skidded away. Klaus watched all this as if he had lost his mind. Meanwhile, the fugitive, seeing the 2 armed SS men, paused, took his hunting rifle off his shoulder, and, pointing the barrel of the rifle somewhere in the ravine, fired a single shot. Klaus immediately realized that Blumenzon's only concern was to distract his pursuers, so he shouted, "Hold your fire!" However, his voice sounded too muffled as the SS men accompanying him, not hearing their commander's order, fired a return volley of shots at the fugitive. Klaus saw that Blumenzon was badly wounded. He threw his hunting rifle into the snow and staggered down the hill, writhing in pain. Esther's silhouette emerged. She shouted something to Klaus, but he did not hear. The soldiers threw something hurtful at her as Esther, leaving her daughter lying in the sleigh, walked down the steep slope after her husband. There was blood on the snow. Klaus realized that Esther had rushed to save her injured husband. He was furious with the soldiers, but he could not really blame them. Although the shooting was unauthorized, it was only a response to an attack by an armed opponent. Klaus waited there for quite a while, but Esther never came back. It was dangerous to follow the fugitives in the heavy snow. Klaus felt that he had committed a serious crime and decided to give up the chase. He spent the night where the Blumenzon family was staying. The owners turned out to be kind and trustworthy people, so Klaus left Esther's little daughter Laura in their care. At dawn, Klaus's nervous tension reached a critical point, and he decided to continue his search for the fugitives. Taking a car, he drove along the bypass roads to a town on the opposite side of the Venediger, thinking that the Blumenzons might have been sheltered by Jewish sympathizers. However, the search was futile. No one had seen the fugitives. No one had seen the strangers. The town's burgomaster suggested visiting the hermit scholar's homestead. Perhaps the fugitives had stayed with them? In order to find Esther, Klaus decided to take this seemingly insignificant chance to visit the Kellerties. However, when they reached the halfway point, a snowstorm of incredible intensity hit, and the military was forced to hurry back, or risk being buried beyond repair. Klaus then realized that for some reason even Mother Nature was hostile to his idea. Klaus returned to Salzburg completely depressed, as if he had lost the meaning of life. Inside his soul he had undergone a complete change. This painful event opened his eyes to the anti-humanist nature of the Nazi genocidal policy against the Jewish people. Klaus was accused by a subordinate of having an affair with a Jewish woman, Esther Blumenzahn, and of shielding her from law enforcement, and then even of fulfilling his mistress's request to free the criminal baritone. It was argued that Schoenecker himself had organized the Blumenzahns' escape from Salzburg and found them a safe hiding place in the Alps. The SS leadership gathered a number of facts proving that Klaus Schoenecker was hostile to the Reich, and he was arrested. No interrogation was necessary, because Klaus himself admitted that everything said about him was pure truth. He spent several months behind bars while awaiting a military tribunal. Klaus was determined to prove that the SS were never German patriots, that they were war criminals. Schoenecker was declared insane and locked up as a dangerous person in a high-security prison. At the end of the war, Schoenecker was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He wrote to Dietrich Leutzl, rising to political prominence. The latter agreed to help Schoeneckeris, who had served 10 years, to leave early and emigrate to the USA with his 18-year-old son Robert. Klaus wanted to know the fate of Esther's daughter Lara, many years later when he went to see Titu. The farmhouse where Klaus left Lara was said to have been sold by the people who lived there after the war. Later, Klaus was informed that Lara's adoptive parents did not live in Austria. Number 11. Dan and Kurt, the main coordinators of the secret Nazi organization Front, are in charge of preparing the hit squad, using the wave therapy equipment they have appropriated from Gregor. This unique invention must be demonstrated at the international meeting of the neo-Nazi board. In a disastrous experiment, the dosage of waves is gradually amplified for the assassins, with the astonishing effect that each of their fighters is equivalent to a dozen ordinary soldiers. The commanders will witness this phenomenon when they arrive. This will be a true renaissance of the neo-Nazi organization. Esther herself finds it strange that she remains full of physical energy even after losing the need for sleep. She is even angry with herself, unable to summon the necessary prophetic imagery by an effort of will. Stressed Grigoris suddenly has a sudden cardiac arrest. His optimism is not extinguished by the supernatural phenomenon of Esther's visions. Could these visions of this woman have been a fleeting effect? One evening, Gregor suspects a heart attack and is taken away by ambulance. That same night, Esther has visions again. As if guided by a skilled craftsman, Esther's hand paints 3 images. The first drawing is a rather ordinary landscape, a lake shore. The second drawing shows a private 2-story house, and the third shows what looks like an underground bunker with the 3 kidnapped people, Gregorio's wife and children. Esther shakes her head, not understanding the nature of these strange visions. Forgetting his heart condition, Gregor returns home. He immediately takes the initiative. He goes to the FBI headquarters in the early hours of the morning to submit Esther's creation. The FBI officers try to sneer at the colored sketches, but his senior colleague BM is silent. He had the same reaction to the sketches that had led to the discovery of the crime ring that day. Although officials do not guarantee that the location depicted in the landscape will be found, they are working on a similar search in and around New York City. But after several days of effort, the result is nil. It is then decided to distribute copies of the drawing to all FBI offices in the states. Suddenly, a message arrives from the state of Michigan. An FBI agent based in Muskegon has identified the landscape. A freshly photographed analog landscape is sent to convince him, the north shore of Muskegon Lake, just outside the giant Michigan. In Muskegon, the FBI conducts round-the-clock surveillance of the area. The coordinators of the secret organization, Dan and Kurt, continue to prepare for the Frente's leaders' meeting. A hitman left on guard suddenly reports a suspicious boat that has been lurking nearby for a couple of days. Meanwhile, another guard claims to have spotted 2 unseen cars in the adjacent street. The Front's camp is in a bit of a turmoil, but by the evening, passions have died down. The suspicious boat has disappeared from sight, and the unseen cars have gone the hell away. There's nothing to fear. The neo-Nazi outpost in the small backwater town of Muskegon was established 40 years ago, and the construction of the underground bunkers has remained unnoticed by the outside eye. The official activities of the organization, moreover, seem to be completely innocent and have so far not been a public embarrassment. The coordinators inform the leaders of Fronto that the neo-Nazi camp is ready for a meeting. 12 FBI agents monitor an area of interest on the North Muskegon tributary. After a relative calm, Sunday sees a stir. The boats going back and forth are hidden in a covered modern marina, so it is impossible to see specific details. Perhaps illegal cargo, say narcotics? In the evening, the traffic dies down. Occasionally, the same people, probably the owners, appear in the yard outside the house. The FBI leadership finally decides to storm. A dozen rapid response troops, a helicopter, and a naval boat with weapons are called in. But before that, a pretext for peaceful access is invented. In the morning, the area under surveillance, 2 policemen call at the gate. A man who claims to be a security guard questions the purpose of the visit in detail. The policemen claim to have received information about an underground pharmaceutical factory operating here. If the owners would kindly show the outbuildings, no coercive procedures would be necessary. It is decided to let the inspectors in, otherwise suspicion would be aroused. After a rather cursory look at the buildings and finding nothing suspicious, the policemen decide to search more thoroughly. The configuration of the premises seemed rather strange. The coordinators are worried. The inspectors know that it is the dining room, from which the dungeon can be accessed, that they are searching. One of the officers is gripping a clunky remote control unit. Pressing the buttons, the floor and the whole bar suddenly start moving. The staircase leading downstairs opens up. The policemen ask, "What is it?" At a signal from Donis, a small man with a small build knocks out one policeman with a blow of inhuman strength, while another is told at gunpoint to report to the center that no evidence of interest to law enforcement has been found. The policeman is forced to comply, but is immediately shot after the phone call. A second policeman, who has not regained consciousness, is also killed. The non-return of the policeman has caused concern within the ranks of the FBI. Command orders an attack. A loudspeaker from a helicopter tells them to surrender. Instead of responding, shots are fired and the area is stormed. Dozens of members of the rapid response team take part. It was thought that once the beachhead was surrounded, the criminals would not resist, but the opposite happens. With modern weaponry, they launch a counterattack. The FBI unit, faced for the first time with unrelenting, indiscriminate death squads, is forced to retreat. Only when army reinforcements are called in does a second wave of attack begin. The battle lasts for several hours until finally a dozen crazed hitmen are destroyed. The capture of a criminal playground reveals incredible things. The leaders of the neo-fascist organization Frontas are found after the discovery of a spacious dungeon equipped with the latest technology. According to one of the arrested leaders, it is possible to survive in this fortress even after the explosion of a nuclear bomb. In addition, dozens of imprisoned unfortunates are found in the dungeons, some of whom have somehow been in captivity for decades. 13. Obviously, Gregor was not informed of the FBI operation, but on the day of the assault, Officer BM does give the name of the location. Gregor decides to leave immediately. Lake Michigan is nearly 2,000 miles from New York. Klaus volunteers to fly with Gregor. Esther does not want to be left behind at such an important moment. Leaving Catherine alone in the house would also be unfriendly. So the 4 of them go to the airport. The foursome flies from New York to Detroit. They change planes in the afternoon and land at Muskegon Airport. Meanwhile, FBI officer BM informs Gregor that the storming of the criminal compound is nearing completion. The officer promises to break the news to Gregor's relatives, no matter how painful. It's a long hour of waiting before the expected phone call comes. BM utters the words, "Shawnekeri, your family is alive and well." He hands the receiver to Jane, who cannot utter a word as tears of joy roll down her face. Sometime later, BM brings Gregorio's wife, son and daughter back from the opposite shore by boat. A touching family reunion takes place. Gregor cannot be happy because he had given up hope of seeing his loved ones alive. No one in the family is found to have any health problems, so everyone rushes happily to Muskegon Airport, where Esther and Catherine are waiting. There are enough seats for the evening flight. So soon, all 7 of them are sitting in the cabin of the plane. The propellers break and the Jetta rolls out onto the runway, but suddenly, the dispatcher revokes the crew's clearance. A police car pulls up to the runway, lights flashing. The stewardess is ordered to drop off the Schoenecker family. All 7 of them get off the plane in surprise. A policeman checks their documents. Then he makes a mobile phone call to someone and hands the receiver to Gregor. "Hey, mister, the FBI seems to be very interested in you." BM's excited voice says, "There are plenty of surprises today. For example, who would have believed that in this hole we would find one of our former boss's assistants?" Gregor retorts, "And this surprise is why the plane was stopped." BM is still agitated. "Not because of that, Schoenecker. The next surprise is especially for you. We found 2 elderly people, a man and a woman, underground. They claim to be, do you know who they are? The Schoeneckers. Although they are prisoners and exhausted, they behave as if they are lucky to be in paradise. They must be out of their minds, they say. Come on, they'll have guests soon. They have even booked a table for 7 people. What do you think? Is this some kind of devil or just a coincidence of the surname Schoenecker?" Gregor is breathless because they are actually 7 now. Gregor does not tell the insiders what the real reason for holding the plane is. Soon, all 7 are taken to the opposite shore. The scene of the armed confrontation is grim. Fire brigades are putting out the fire, ambulances are transporting the injured, experts are examining the dead, and other services are working. FBI officials claim that Esther's leads led to the sensational capture and destruction of a clandestine neo-fascist organization's base at Lake Muskegon. An investigation is promised into the group's involvement in the 1963 plot to assassinate the American president. Together with Gregorus's parents, several other people regained their freedom as a result of neo-Nazi anti-state activities witnesses. This is also where Schoenecker's wave therapy equipment is found. Officer BM is not surprised. Schoenecker's company consists of 7 persons. Everyone is led to the underground hall, where a table of food is set up. A feast during the plague? Gregor is anxiously squinting at the spot. Something very important may be about to happen here. And then 2 gray-headed men and a woman appear, frozen in the doorway. Their eyes are full of tears, and they don't seem to see all the guests. The first to recover is the old man Klaus. "Is that you, my son? You are Robert, aren't you?" A man of about 60 years of age, standing in the doorway, looks lost. "Here, dear father." Finally realizing the truth, Gregor takes the stranger's hand. "Mother?" The woman says through her tears, "You don't recognize, oh yes, we were separated 40 years ago." Gregor hugs his mother, then his father. Klaus also joins the warm embrace of the family. Finally, Jane and the children join their family. Only Esther and Catherine are left behind, smiling as they watch the exciting spectacle. Finally, Gregor introduces the sick woman to her parents. "We must be grateful to this woman. If it weren't for her phenomenal qualities, we would probably never have met." "What is her name?" asks Gregor's mother. "It's Esther. She's from Austria," says Gregor, and adds, "She's a lethargy patient who's been sleeping on the Venediger for over 60 years. Gregor's mother is extremely surprised by this unheard-of sensation. The table is reserved for 9 people. Gregor asks, "Mom, is this a coincidence?" Dorothy Schoenecker replies, "No, it's not a coincidence. I already knew yesterday how many guests I would have, but the fact that there are 9 people here remains a mystery to me." Gregor is surprised. Robert, his father, explains, "Your mother also has special abilities. That's why we were captured dozens of years ago." The audience listens to the moving story of Gregorio's parents. Robert and Dorothy met in 1959. They both worked for John Kennedy's campaign headquarters in New York. After falling in love at first sight, they married in 1960 and had a son, Gregor, in 1961. Dorothy had a supernatural gift. She sometimes predicted important events. Here's the spouse. She met Robert quite by chance. She joined Kennedy's campaign staff, knowing that it was where you will meet the love of your life. Dorothy was an important person in the electoral company, as she sometimes predicted which states, with which margin, and which presidential candidate would the winner. However, Dorothy's special skills were not celebrated, as it was the higher-ranking members of the team who had to take credit for her victory. As you know, in 1963, one of the most shameful things in American history happened. President of the United States is assassinated. The failure to prevent the cold-blooded plot was partly due to Kennedy's ignorance of the presence of a woman with unique powers on his team. And so it was that shortly before the fateful day of 23rd of November, Dorothy was struck by a prophetic dream about a plot to assassinate the president of the country in Dallas. The Schoneckers immediately informed a high-ranking FBI official. However, instead of the officer taking every precaution, the two Schoneckers were secretly taken to an unknown destination and locked up. Since then, Gregor's parents have been prisoners of war for the past 40 years. Why did they leave them alive? Probably because Dorothy's unique powers of foretelling the future were appreciated by the leaders of the secret organization. And later, Dorothy prophetically foresaw many important events. A promise was made to the couple. If they agreed to cooperate in good faith, their son Gregor would be left alone. In addition, the parents were promised to supply detailed information about their son's life. Thus, the parents knew everything about Gregor, had collected piles of photos and videos, had access to information about his medical studies, his wife and children, and many other family concerns. Although the media did not report it, Gregorio's parents found out, and both of them had to endure the abduction of their son's family. Recently, Dorothy has been tormented by the realization that Gregorio's wife and children are locked up here in this dungeon. Even before the storming began, Dorothy had predicted that the prisoners here would soon be freed and that very close people would meet here. Number 15. Meanwhile, Esther looks up and notices a prominent crescent-shaped mole on Dorothy's neck. Esther's heart squeezes. She thinks of her little daughter Laura, who has an identical congenital birthmark. Dorothy says, "I first met Robert in January 1959 in New York. It was evening and raining. I was rushing home in the rain without an umbrella, soaking wet. Suddenly a car stopped, and a guy I had seen was behind the wheel. He smiled and asked me to get in. I didn't recognize Robert, even though we both worked in the same election headquarters." But Esther intervenes. "I'm sorry, but that's not the first time you saw me." Everyone's eyes are bulging. Does Gregorio's patient also know about the Schonecker family life? But Esther continues, unperturbed. "You won't believe this happened in the spring of 1941 in Salzburg, Austria. On that fateful evening, Klaus stopped to pick up a woman carrying her 1-year-old daughter Lara. And Klaus's son, Robert, was 5 at the time. Do you still remember those events, Klaus? It takes your breath away when you're sitting at the table. Hearing is just an eyesore." Meanwhile, Esther looks at Dorothy and says, "My daughter, I have found you at last." Dorothy stands up with a confused look. She says, "Am I your daughter? That's nonsense." Esther continues, "Yes, you are my lost daughter, Lara Blumensen. Is that true, Klaus?" Klaus says to Esther, confused, "I left your little daughter with decent people then. Do you still remember the remote mountain homestead where you, a family of persecuted fugitives, were sheltered and put up for the night? The owners of the homestead, who had lost both of their sons in the war, were overjoyed to be able to provide care for a baby who has lost her mother. And then, no matter how hard I tried to find out what your daughter's fate was, I didn't find out anything more about Lara." Esther continues, "My Lara had 2 crescent-shaped moles, one on her neck and one between her shoulder blades." Gregor speaks up in excitement. "Is that hard for you to believe, Mum?" Dorothy, "Yes, it's hard, but I have these moles, so I'm Lara Blumensen? Lord, what war does to people's destinies." Both Esther and Gregorio's mother weep. As the excitement of the discovery continues, Gregor silences his family. He says, "And now I would like to surprise Esther, my grandmother, even though the name grandmother doesn't really suit her. Esther, did you mention you have another child?" "Yes, I would like to believe that, because before the accident I was already 7 months pregnant. But whether I gave birth to a child, I don't know." "You gave birth to a child. Here she is, your second daughter," and points to Catherine. The news is so joyful that everyone is now gathered in each other's arms. There is a state of indescribable euphoria at the table. It turns out that the 9 people sitting here are related to each other by a close kinship. Gregor says to the old man, "So I am a Jew by my mother's bloodline?" So not German, as I thought all my life? I understand you. Are you relieved now? Is it a heavy burden to be the representative of a nation that perpetrated the Holocaust? But it's not really what you think. Being German does not in any way mean being a Nazi. Gregor is suddenly overwhelmed by indescribable euphoria. Unbeknownst to those around him, he loses consciousness and collapses. Worried relatives rush to resuscitate him, but Jane reassures them by saying that this is not the first time her husband has fallen into a brief, lethargic state. Esther adds, "I remember when I was young, something similar used to happen to me, but the attack went away quite quickly. It seems to run in our family. Come on, my dear grandchild, it's time you woke up." At Esther's words, Gregor opens his eyes. He is surprised to see his relatives surrounding him. Soon, a beatific smile appears on everyone's face. The end. 2223570. # copyright 2024 by Arnaldas Razma, all rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including photocopying, recording, or other electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical reviews and certain other non-commercial uses permitted by copyright law.